A question some people have is, why did God allow Bible characters to have multiple wives in the Old Testament? Or did He? You may be surprised by the answers. We are about to wade into deep water here, so if you're up for it, join me. I made a video recently about the challenges of writing fiction based on 3,000-year-old Bible stories, and in working on that video, I found I was spending a lot of time on marriage customs in that culture, and I realized I need to address a question a lot of people have. Why did God allow polygamy in the Old Testament? Or did He allow it? Did He really condemn it, but they did it anyway? I'm going to go through this topic, and I promise, if you stick around to the end, I'll answer the question about what our position on this difficult topic should be today. If you don't think it's difficult, then you haven't studied it. Today our automatic reaction is that polygamy is bad. In fact, in Western countries, it's illegal because of bigamy laws. Because our culture today sees it as bad, it's easy for us to say, see, the people in the Bible had all this trouble because they practiced polygamy, so polygamy is immoral. But monogamous marriages often have trouble too. What is the divorce rate in the U.S.? I don't know, but it's too high, and that has caused some people to swear off marriage altogether. In fact, 85% of Gen Z says marriage is not necessary to have a fulfilled life. So, was polygamy condemned in the Old Testament? The short answer is no. Why is polygamy never condemned in the Old Testament? There are chapters in Leviticus 18 and 20 and Deuteronomy 21 and 22 that harshly condemn sexual immorality and even prescribe the death penalty for these activities, but they do not mention polygamy. Here are some stark examples from Leviticus 18. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. If a man has sexual relations with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, both of them are to be put to death. What they have done is a perversion. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. And it keeps going, condemning various forms of incest and bestiality and assigning terrible penalties, but it never mentions polygamy. There is a verse in Deuteronomy that talks about polygamy, and from it we can draw some surprising conclusions. Deuteronomy 21:15 says, "If a man has 2 wives, and he loves one and not the other, and both bear him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the wife he does not love, when he wills his property to his sons, he must not give the rights of the firstborn to the son of the wife he loves, in preference to his actual firstborn, the son of the wife he does not love." So this one sentence points out several differences between their culture and ours. Number 1. It says, if a man has 2 wives. Notice that this text does not condemn polygamy, but acknowledges it was common. The passage goes on to explain how to treat everyone fairly in a polygamous marriage. Number 2. Women could not own or inherit property or work outside the home, much like many Muslim countries today. If a woman had no husband, the only options open to her might be prostitution or slavery. Polygamy was a better option than prostitution or slavery. Number 3. Having sons was very important. If a wife couldn't give her husband a son, he would marry another wife until he got the sons he needed to run the family farm, defend the clan against enemies, etc. Without sons, the family property couldn't pass from one generation to another. Today, if a family consists of mom, dad, and 4 daughters, it's no big deal. But back then, it was catastrophic. The daughters couldn't earn a living after their father died. They had to be married so they would be provided for, but they couldn't inherit the family's wealth. Number 4. The firstborn son got a double portion of the inheritance, and this verse in Deuteronomy tells men to honor the firstborn, whether the firstborn was the child of their favored wife or not. A similar text is Exodus 21:10. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first of one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. In context, this verse is talking about a man who marries a slave woman. Slavery is a whole other controversial subject in the OT. Another video, another time. The focus of these 2 passages is not to condemn polygamy, but to ensure that women are treated well in polygamous marriages. Then there's 2 Chronicles 24:2-3, talking about King Joash of Judah. Joash was a descendant of King David. Joash did what was pleasing the Lord's sight throughout the lifetime of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada chose 2 wives for King Joash, and he had sons and daughters. So Joash did right in the Lord's sight while marrying 2 wives selected for him by the priest. Not everyone in the Old Testament had multiple wives, but there's a long list of prominent Bible characters who had more than one wife. Abraham had a wife and a concubine at the same time. It is clear this wasn't God's plan for him. He had Ishmael because he and Sarah grew impatient about the son God promised he and Sarah would have. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, later named Israel, had 4 wives, which allowed him to have 12 sons that gave their names to the 12 tribes of Israel, and, according to the book of Revelation, those 12 tribes will be enshrined in the architecture of the New Jerusalem. Their names will be on the 12 gates of the city. Moses had 2 wives during the Exodus and wilderness wandering. You've probably heard the story about Gideon and his 300 who defeated a Midianite army many times their size. In the book of Judges, we learn that Gideon had 60 sons. We aren't told how many wives he had, but I can guarantee he didn't have 60 sons by one wife. With that many sons, he must have had daughters too, so he could well have had over 100 children. In 1 and 2 Samuel, which are the basis of the novels in my Age of the Kingdom series, we learn that King David had 8 wives and at least 20 concubines. All of the patriarchs, judges, and kings I have mentioned are also listed among Hebrews 11's heroes of faith. They were all documented to have more than one wife and or concubine at one time. King David's son, King Solomon, left all the rest in the dust. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Solomon was said to be the wisest man who ever lived, but the fact that he had 1,000 wives and concubines might call that into question. We have to remember that there are categories of prohibitions: legal, moral, and culturally appropriate. Number 1. Legal prohibitions are things against which secular laws have been passed by legislatures or councils. Some things are illegal, but not immoral or culturally inappropriate. For example, in the United States, it's illegal to drive a car on the left side of the road. Doing so will get you stopped, ticketed, and fined. But is it immoral to drive on the left side of the road? No, because in the UK and a few other countries, it's illegal to drive on the right side of the road. So which side of the road you drive on can't be a moral issue, but it is definitely a legal and safety issue. Number 2, moral. Some things are immoral, but not illegal. Example: the 10 Commandments says it's a sin to tell a lie. Lying is not illegal. You won't be given a ticket and fined if you tell a lie in your daily life. That is, unless you are in court and have sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Number 3, cultural appropriateness. Some things are cultural taboos, but are neither immoral nor illegal. Example: in the U.S., you can ask what someone does for a living. That's fine. You're just making conversation. But you better not ask them how much money they make. There's no law against it, nor is it morally wrong, but it's tasteless and will not be appreciated. So we have to distinguish between things that are illegal, immoral, or culturally inappropriate. They may not always be the same. But isn't polygamy a violation of the seventh commandment? The seventh commandment says, "Do not commit adultery." And, as we saw in Leviticus, adultery was punishable by death. That was what the law said. So for Israelites, adultery was illegal. But because it was part of God's law, it was also immoral. However, polygamy was not considered adultery. How do we know? When King David committed adultery with Bathsheba, he already had 7 wives and 20 or more concubines. When the prophet confronted him, he did not accuse David of adultery because of those previous marriages. He was guilty of adultery because Bathsheba was the wife of another man. So, polygamy was not adultery. Today, a man can go to prison for being married to more than one woman at once. It's the crime of bigamy. But 3,000 years ago, there were structural issues in the culture that made polygamy better than some of the alternatives. But what about the New Testament? Doesn't it condemn polygamy? It's true that there is a statement in 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, saying that elders and deacons should be the husband of one wife, which I guess can be taken a couple of ways. Either they must be married and not single, or if they marry, they can only be married to one woman. But this is for elders and deacons. It doesn't say anything about people in the pew. Paul was writing to Timothy at least 1,000 years after King David, and the culture had changed greatly. Greek culture had transformed the then-known world, and the Greeks were largely monogamous. So, Paul's concern was that having multiple wives, which was common in the Middle East, would bring criticism on the church from those who came from Greek culture in the West. In fact, Paul twice mentions the word reproach in 1 Timothy 3, once at the beginning of his statement about elders or bishops, and again before talking about deacons. It is in the context of a long list of attributes that would make elders and deacons respected in the community. He's saying having more than one wife might bring reproach on the church. It's apparent that he was concerned that polygamy, as still practiced in Asia, would be a stumbling block for those in Europe who were monogamous. If Paul considered polygamy to be a sin, he would have told all Christian men to have only one wife. In Acts 17:30, the Apostle Paul says, "In the past God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent." Paul was talking about idol worship here, but maybe this also applies to things like polygamy. While there are no direct condemnations of polygamy in the Old Testament, there are passages that would make us think it's not God's ideal. In the beginning, when God created humankind, he gave Adam one wife. This is not stated as a command, it was just a fact. Perhaps we are to see this as an ideal principle, but it doesn't say it. It does say in Genesis 2:24, "A man shall leave his father and mother and unite with his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Of course, Adam didn't have a father and mother, so the text is drawing a conclusion for later generations. It's interesting that when Jesus quotes this text, he says, "They two shall become one flesh." The word two isn't in the original Hebrew of Genesis 2, but it is in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, so that must have been what Jesus was quoting. Deuteronomy 17:17 says kings shouldn't take many wives. It also says kings shouldn't have a lot of horses or a lot of silver and gold, so these admonitions appear to be concerned with something other than morality. As we've seen, David and Solomon pretty much ignored that passage. What about today? Today, women have a very different status in Western culture than they did in the Middle East 3,000 years ago. Then the status of women was more like it is in Muslim countries today. In fact, women have a much different status in the United States today than 100 years ago. The change in status of women in our culture started with Jesus Christ. He treated women better than his culture did. In the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "You've heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you have already committed adultery." That was revolutionary to them at that time. Jesus also showed mercy to the woman caught in adultery. The men who accused her to Jesus were going to execute her by stoning according to the Mosaic law, but Jesus told them whoever was without sin should cast the first stone. They got the point. Of course, the law of Moses says to execute the man in the adulterous relationship as well as the woman, but they somehow forgot that. There were also many women who had prominent roles in the formation of the Christian church. In fact, one of the proofs that Jesus rose from the dead is that the women were the first to testify that he had risen. It's a proof of Jesus' resurrection, because if the apostles had made up the story of Jesus rising from the dead, they never would have cited the testimony of women, because women were not allowed to testify in court. They were not considered reliable witnesses. If they were making the story up, they would have had men testifying. So that means the apostles really believed he rose from the dead and were telling the truth. There were also women in the early church who were prominent. It didn't happen overnight, and Greek culture had a part to play in democratizing relationships between the genders, but the message of the gospel bore fruit in raising of status of women as well as righting other wrongs, like the eventual abolition of slavery in the West after thousands of years of that practice. So, what can we conclude? Polygamy is both illegal and a cultural taboo today, but is it immoral? As we have seen, you will look in vain for a clear, blanket condemnation of polygamy in the Bible, even in the New Testament. Rather, the passages seem to be more concerned about making sure polygamy was conducted with charity toward all parties and wouldn't bring reproach on the church. Noting that there were problems in polygamous marriages is not an argument against it, because we shouldn't use problems in monogamous marriages as an argument for ending marriage altogether. Today, women have agency and empowerment they didn't have in Bible times. They can get an education, they can vote, they can work outside the home and start businesses. If a man abandons his wife, it isn't good, but she won't have to choose between starving and entering prostitution like she would have in Bible times. Could something like polygamy not be a sin in Old Testament times, but be a sin today? Hebrews 13:8 says, "Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But do his expectations for his people change?" Remember Paul's admonition to elders and deacons to do nothing that would bring reproach on the church. Since polygamy is illegal today, any Christian who married more than one person at a time would definitely bring reproach on themselves and the church. In our culture today, polygamy is not an option because it's illegal as well as culturally outrageous, but for more guidance, we can quote the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5:25. "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." For men to truly love and honor their wives today, when women have equality with men shouldn't disrespect their wives by bringing other women into the relationship. This should be our position today, even though the culture in Bible times was different. Well, that's all for this time. I hope you enjoyed this content. If you did, like and subscribe to my channel. And if you're just getting started reading the Bible, there's some links in the description below to some books that might help you get started. See you next time.